In July 1891, standing before the altar at Windsor Castle, Prince Aribert appeared to be the perfect storybook hero. Tall, regal in his uniform, and holding the hand of Queen Victoria's granddaughter, he seemed the epitome of imperial duty. But this glittering ceremony was built on a foundation of desperate silence. To Prince Aribert, this marriage was not a union of hearts, but a frantic attempt to build a shield against the world, and against paragraph 175, the German law that classified his true nature as a felony. He did not marry because he loved a woman. He married because his society left him no other way to survive. 9 years later, when a telegram ruthlessly dissolved this union, it revealed the devastating cost of the closet. Was the tragedy caused by a husband's betrayal, or by a world that forced a man to turn a marriage vow into a camouflage? Here is the story of a love that dared not speak its name, and the innocent woman who became the collateral damage of a secret war. But to see the true reasons why a marriage blessed by Queen Victoria herself could be annihilated with such ruthless speed, we cannot simply look at the events of 1900. We must go back a decade to the world that built this trap. We must look at the machinery of the Victorian marriage market and the two mismatched souls who were fed into its gears. The late 19th century was not a romantic era for royalty. It was an era of strategic acquisitions. At the center of this geopolitical spiderweb sat Queen Victoria. By 1890, she was an elderly, formidable matriarch, dressed perpetually in black mourning weeds, ruling over the largest empire in human history. But her power wasn't just in battleships and trade routes. It was in blood. Victoria believed with an almost religious fervor that the stability of Europe depended on her descendants occupying every throne on the continent. She viewed her children and grandchildren not merely as family, but as biological diplomats. Her letters from this period are less like a grandmother's notes and more like a stud farmer's ledger. She analyzed teeth, hips, temperaments, and incomes. Her favorite hunting ground was Germany. The queen herself was ethnically German. The House of Hanover was German. Her beloved late husband Albert was German. She saw the rising Prussian Empire not as a threat, but as a natural partner. In this grand scheme, Princess Marie-Louise was a valuable, if minor, asset. Born in 1872 at Cumberland Lodge in Windsor Great Park, Louise was the younger daughter of Princess Helena. Her upbringing was suffocatingly safe. While the world outside was industrializing and modernizing, Cumberland Lodge remained a bubble of mid-Victorian values. Louise was educated by governesses, taught to paint watercolors, play the piano, and fear God. She was intelligent, far more intelligent than many gave her credit for. But she was dangerously naive. She had been fed a steady diet of the Albert myth. She grew up in the shadow of her grandmother's obsession with Prince Albert, the perfect husband, the perfect father, the perfect man. Louise didn't just want a husband, she wanted an Albert. She expected a union of mind, souls, and bodies. She expected that if she did her duty, love would naturally follow. She had no idea that the world outside Windsor operated on a very different, much colder set of rules. If Marie-Louise was the open book, Prince Aribert was the cipher. Born in 1866, Aribert Joseph Alexander was the fourth son of Friedrich I, the reigning Duke of Anhalt. To the modern observer, Anhalt sounds like a footnote, but in the 1890s it was a proud sovereign duchy with its own capital in Dessau. However, like all German states, it had been swallowed up by the unification of Germany in 1871. It retained its duke and its court, but its military and foreign policy were controlled by Berlin and the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Aribert was the quintessential product of this militarized society. Because he was a fourth son, he had zero chance of inheriting the dukedom. In the German aristocratic system, younger sons had only one respectable path: the army. Aribert was sent to the Prussian military academy. He was molded into an officer of the elite Garde du Corps, lifeguards, in Berlin. Visually, he was spectacular. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the classic high forehead and piercing eyes of the Ascanian dynasty, he looked like a statue of a Teutonic knight come to life. But beneath the uniform, Aribert was a complex, tormented man. He was artistic. He had a deep, almost obsessive love for music and architecture. He possessed a sensitive nature that was completely at odds with the coarse, aggressive culture of the Prussian officer mess. Crucially, Aribert had a secret. In 1890s Berlin, a distinct subculture was forming. It was a world of men who loved men, though the terminology of the time was vague and medicalized. It was a criminal offense under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, punishable by imprisonment. But in the highest echelons of the aristocracy, specifically within the elite regiments, there was a culture of unspoken tolerance, provided one was discreet. Aribert lived a double life. By day, he was the stern Prussian officer, clicking his heels and saluting the Kaiser. By night, or during his frequent vacations to Italy, he was a man seeking a connection that his society deemed an abomination. He was friends, close friends, with Kaiser Wilhelm II. The young Kaiser, bombastic and erratic, surrounded himself with handsome, artistic men. While the Kaiser's own sexuality remains a subject of heated historical debate, the circle he cultivated was undeniably queer-coded. Aribert fit perfectly into this glittering, fragile world. But a prince cannot remain a bachelor forever. By the time he reached his mid-20s, the pressure was mounting. A bachelor prince was suspicious. A bachelor prince did not produce heirs. A bachelor prince was vulnerable to rumors. Aribert needed a shield. He needed a wife who was unimpeachable, high-ranking, and preferably foreign, so she wouldn't understand the gossip circulating in the Berlin salons. The trap was sprung in the autumn of 1890. Marie-Louise, then 18 years old, traveled to Berlin for the wedding of her cousin, Princess Victoria of Prussia. It was her first real taste of the dazzling, dangerous world of the German imperial court. Berlin was louder, brighter, and harder than Windsor. At a state banquet, she was seated next to Prince Aribert. To Louis, it must have felt like destiny. Here was a man who looked like a storybook prince. He was 6 years older, sophisticated, and attentive. He spoke perfect English. He asked her about her interests. He listened. For Aribert, this was likely a calculation. Here was a granddaughter of the Queen of England. She was plain but pleasant. She was young enough to be molded. Marrying her would cement his standing with the Kaiser and would instantly elevate his status in society. It would stop the whispers about his private life. It was the perfect cover. He turned on the charm. The courtship was brief, intense, and entirely performative. He didn't court her with passion. He courted her with the efficiency of a military campaign. He proposed in the gardens of the Neues Palais in Potsdam. The setting was idyllic. Autumn leaves, Baroque architecture, the setting sun. Marie-Louise said yes immediately. She wrote home in a frenzy of joy, telling her mother that she had found her soulmate. She did not notice the red flags. She did not notice that he never tried to hold her hand when they were alone. She did not notice that his eyes often drifted past her, towards his fellow officers. She interpreted his reserve as royal dignity. She interpreted his lack of physical aggression as gentlemanly respect. When the news reached Queen Victoria, she was delighted, writing, "I am so glad for my dear Louis. Aribert is very nice and amiable." The Queen's approval sealed their fate. Had Victoria been younger, sharper, or perhaps less obsessed with German alliances, she might have ordered her spies to look closer at the young Prince of Anhalt. She might have heard the rumors drifting up from the barracks of the lifeguards, but she didn't. She saw a handsome uniform and a British alliance. The Kaiser was equally ecstatic. He viewed the marriage as a personal victory. He had successfully planted one of his own men in the British royal family. The date was set for July 6th, 1891. The venue? St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The wedding day was a masterpiece of Victorian theater. The weather was perfect. The streets of Windsor were lined with cheering crowds. The chapel was packed with the crowned heads of Europe. Marie-Louise wore a dress of white satin, heavy with orange blossoms and Honiton lace, the same lace her mother and grandmother had worn. She walked down the aisle on the arm of her father, trembling with happiness. She was marrying the man she loved. Waiting at the altar, Prince Aribert stood in the blue and silver uniform of the Anhalt military. Witnesses described him as looking pale but composed. He was doing his duty. He was locking the door of his closet and throwing away the key. But there was a moment, recorded by a keen-eyed observer, that hinted at the disaster to come. During the service, when the Archbishop asked Aribert if he would take this woman to be his wedded wife, there was a hesitation, a split second of silence that hung in the humid air of the chapel before he answered, "I will." It wasn't the hesitation of a nervous groom. It was the hesitation of a man who knew he was committing perjury before God. The reception was held in the state dining room at Windsor, where toasts were drunk and speeches made about the eternal bond between England and Germany. But as the couple was cheered away for their honeymoon, the performance abruptly ended. The carriage wheels clattered over the cobblestones of Windsor, the cheering crowds fading into a distant rhythmic hum. Inside the velvet-lined compartment, the air grew heavy, suffocated by the scent of crushed orange blossoms and the sudden deafening silence. Princess Marie-Louise turned her face toward her new husband, a smile trembling on her lips, waiting for the mask of protocol to drop. She waited for Prince Aribert to take her hand, to exhale the tension of the ceremony, to offer a word of intimacy now that the eyes of the world were no longer upon them. He did not turn. He sat ramrod straight, his gloved hands resting motionless on his knees, his gaze fixed on the passing English countryside through the window. The profile that had seemed so noble in the candlelight of the chapel now appeared cut from cold marble. When he finally spoke, it was to comment on the efficiency of the railway schedule to the coast. The temperature in the carriage seemed to plummet. In that first hour of their married life, Marie-Louise felt a chill that would never leave her, a subtle premonition that the fairy tale had ended the moment the vows were spoken. They traveled to the Netherlands for the first leg of their honeymoon, staying at the seaside resort of Scheveningen. It was a fashionable destination known for its bracing winds and gray rolling surf. It proved a fitting backdrop for the revelation of their reality. A honeymoon is traditionally the forging of a union, a time of awkward but tender discovery. For Aribert and Marie-Louise, it was a masterclass in estrangement. Aribert was impeccably polite. He opened doors. He ordered the finest meals. He walked with her along the promenade in the afternoons, nodding to well-wishers. But he treated her with the detached courtesy one might offer a distant cousin or a visiting dignitary. There was a physical boundary he refused to cross, an invisible wall erected around his person. When they retired to their suite at night, the silence became a physical weight. He would bid her good night with a stiff bow and retreat to his own dressing room, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the young princess's heart. Marie-Louise was naive, but she was not stupid. She had grown up in the shadow of her grandmother's legends of passion. She knew that marriage involved a surrender, a joining of bodies. Night after night, she waited. Night after night, she remained alone in the darkness, listening to the pacing of her husband in the adjoining room. She told herself he was tired. She told herself he was respectful of her innocence. She told herself that this was the German way, reserved, disciplined, slow to burn. She fabricated 1,000 excuses to protect herself from the bruising truth that her husband found the idea of touching her not merely unappealing, but impossible. By the time they boarded the train for Germany, the pattern was set. They were not lovers. They were not even friends. They were colleagues in a dynastic enterprise, bound by a contract that one party had no intention of fulfilling. Crossing the border into Germany, the landscape changed, and so did Aribert. As the familiar sights of the fatherland appeared, the rigid lines of pine forests, the spiked helmets of station guards, he seemed to relax, shedding some of his stiffness. But this relaxation did not bring him closer to her. It merely allowed him to retreat further into his own world. He spoke more, but not to her. He spoke of regiments, of hunting, of the upcoming season in Berlin. He was returning to the stage where he knew his lines perfectly. Their destination was Dessau, the capital of the Duchy of Anhalt. To Marie-Louise, raised in the sprawling, verdant, chaotic beauty of Windsor and the refined elegance of London, Dessau was a shock. It was a stark, austere city dominated by the ducal palace, a structure that felt less like a home and more like a fortress against the world. If Aribert was the lock, his father, Duke Friedrich I, was the jailer. The reigning duke was a terrifying figure. An old soldier of the Prussian mold, he believed that a family should be run with the same iron discipline as an infantry battalion. He ruled the court of Dessau with a stopwatch and a glare. Life in the palace was regulated to the minute. Breakfast was at 8, correspondence until 10, a drive in the carriage at 11, lunch at 1. Anyone arriving 30 seconds late faced a stony silence that could wither the soul. Marie-Louise, spirited and accustomed to the somewhat eccentric warmth of her British relatives, found herself gasping for air. The etiquette was suffocating. Every conversation was scripted. Every movement was scrutinized. She was no longer Louis. She was Her Highness, a mannequin to be draped in jewels and paraded at state functions. But the crushing boredom of Dessau was preferable to the loneliness that awaited her in Berlin. When the season began, the couple moved to the capital of the empire. Berlin in the 1890s was a city exploding with energy. It was the Chicago on the spree, a place of electric lights, roaring industry, and aggressive militarism. It was loud, brash, and relentlessly masculine. Here, Aribert came alive. In Berlin, Aribert was a star. He was tall, handsome, and an officer in the Garde du Corps, the most prestigious regiment in the German army. He looked magnificent in his uniform, the white tunic, the silver breastplate, the eagle-topped helmet. He was a favorite of the Kaiser, a fixture at the most exclusive clubs, and he effectively abandoned his wife. Their apartment in Berlin became a waiting room for Marie-Louise. Aribert would leave early in the morning for his military duties, returning only to change clothes before vanishing into the night. He had a social calendar that was suspiciously full. Regimental dinners, he would say, a meeting at the officers' club, a private recital. He was always surrounded by men, beautiful, artistic, witty men. He moved in a circle that Marie-Louise could not enter, a circle of intense male friendships that operated on a frequency she couldn't tune into. She would see them at the opera. Aribert leaning close to a fellow officer, whispering, laughing with a genuine spark in his eyes that she had never seen directed at her. When she approached, the laughter would die, replaced by the mask of polite indifference. She tried to be the perfect German wife. She learned the language until she spoke it flawlessly. She memorized the military ranks. She learned to embroider, to sit still for hours, to repress her natural English spontaneity. She wrote letters home to Windsor that were masterpieces of omission. "Aribert is so busy with his duties," she would write to her mother. "The Kaiser was very kind to us at the parade." She painted a picture of a busy, happy life, terrified that if she admitted the truth, that she was desperately lonely and that her husband was a stranger, the shame would be unbearable. The weeks turned into months, and the months into years. The lack of intimacy festered. In the 1890s, the primary duty of a royal wife was to produce an heir. The court watched her waistline with predatory interest. Every month that passed without an announcement brought raised eyebrows and whispered speculations. Aribert's reaction to this pressure was to withdraw further. He began to take vacations without her. He discovered the allure of Italy, specifically the island of Capri and the coastal towns of the Mediterranean. He would disappear for weeks, citing his health, his nerves, his need for the warm southern air. He never invited her. Left behind in the gray drizzle of Berlin or the stifling silence of Dessau, Marie-Louise began to wither. She was a woman of flesh and blood, starving for affection. She began to question herself. Was she repulsive? Was she too English? Was she too dull? She scrutinized her reflection in the heavy, gilt-framed mirrors of the palace, looking for the flaw that made her husband recoil from her touch. She did not know that the flaw was not in her face or her body, but in the gender she possessed. There were moments of near breaking. One evening, after a state dinner where Aribert had spent the entire meal ignoring her to converse with a young attaché, she confronted him. It was a rare breach of protocol. She demanded to know why he was so cold, why he preferred the company of his soldiers to his wife. Aribert turned on her with a flash of rage that was terrifying because it was so rare. He did not yell. His voice dropped to a hiss. He told her she was hysterical. He told her she did not understand the burdens of a German prince. He told her that her duty was to support him, not to nag him like a fishwife. He looked at her with an expression of such profound distaste that she recoiled. It wasn't hatred in his eyes, it was panic. It was the look of a man guarding a fortress who sees the enemy at the gate. He fled the room, and the next day he left for Rome. It was during these long absences that the rumors began to reach even the sheltered ears of the princess. Berlin was a city of gossips. Servants talked. Ladies-in-waiting whispered behind fans. They spoke of the knights of the Round Table, the circle of men around the Kaiser's friend, Prince Eulenburg. They spoke of Greek love. They spoke of certain hotels, certain parks at dusk. Marie-Louise didn't understand the full implications. Her Victorian upbringing had given her no vocabulary for such things. But she understood that she was competing with a ghost. She was fighting a battle she couldn't see, against an enemy she couldn't name. The isolation was total. In Anhalt, Duke Friedrich watched her like a hawk, waiting for her to slip up, to fail in her etiquette. In Berlin, she was a piece of furniture in her own home. She threw herself into charity work, visiting hospitals, organizing bazaars, trying to find some purpose for her existence. She became beloved by the common people who saw a sad, sweet-faced princess doing good works. But public adoration is a cold substitute for private love. By the turn of the century, 9 years had passed. 9 years of a white marriage. 9 years of lying in letters home. Marie-Louise was 28, but she felt old. Her youth had been drained away by the vampire of duty. And Aribert? He was becoming careless. The strain of the double life was wearing on him. The mask was slipping. He was taking risks. emboldened by his friendship with the Kaiser and the arrogance of his station. He believed he was untouchable. He believed that as long as the marriage existed on paper, he was safe. He did not realize that the ice he was walking on was thinning with every trip to the south, with every discreet letter sent to a male friend, with every glance that lingered a second too long. The year 1900 arrived with the promise of a new century. But for the house of Anhalt, it brought only the gathering of storm clouds. Aribert grew increasingly erratic. He was moody, prone to fits of melancholy followed by manic social activity. He began to drink more heavily. The pressure of the deception was cracking the porcelain veneer of the perfect prince. Then came the invitation to Canada. Lord Minto, the Governor-General, invited Princess Marie-Louise to tour the Dominion. It was a prestigious offer, a chance to represent the Queen. Aribert encouraged her to go. In fact, he insisted on it. He seemed almost desperate to have her out of the country, out of the house, out of the way. "It will be good for you," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "The sea air, the change of scenery." Marie-Louise accepted. She saw it as an escape, a brief respite from the suffocating atmosphere of her non-life. She packed her trunks with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt since her wedding day. She said goodbye to Aribert in the hallway of their Berlin apartment. He kissed her hand, a dry, perfunctory peck. "Goodbye, Louis," he said. She did not know it was the last time she would ever hear his voice. She did not know that as she walked out the door, she was leaving the stage clear for the final act of the tragedy. She boarded the ship for Canada, watching the coast of Europe fade into the mist, believing she would return in a few months refreshed and ready to endure another decade of silence. But back in Berlin, the silence was about to be broken. While she sailed across the Atlantic, the carefully constructed walls of Prince Aribert's life were beginning to buckle. A servant had seen something. A letter had been intercepted. A whisper had reached the wrong ear, or perhaps the right one. The Duke of Anhalt was listening. The trap that had been set 10 years ago was about to snap shut, but it wouldn't catch the victim anyone expected. While Princess Marie-Louise was being toasted in the banquet halls of Ottawa, accepting bouquets of frozen flowers and charming the Canadian colonial elite, her husband was walking a tightrope over an abyss. Prince Aribert was alone in Germany. For the first time in 9 years, the shield of his wife's presence was entirely removed. There was no one to sit opposite him at dinner, no one to accompany him to the opera, no one to maintain the facade of the happy domestic sphere. To the casual observer, he was a bachelor prince once more, free to govern his own time. But freedom, for a man like Aribert, was a dangerous narcotic. Berlin in the late autumn was a city of early twilights and gaslit shadows. The atmosphere in the capital was feverish. The German Empire was flexing its muscles. The naval race with Britain was heating up. The sense of national invincibility was intoxicating. In the barracks of the Garde du Corps, the air was thick with testosterone and arrogance. The officers believed they were gods in uniform, immune to the petty laws that governed civilians. Aribert, emboldened by his wife's absence and perhaps exhausted by a decade of repression, began to take risks that were previously unthinkable. He spent less time at the palace and more time in the private quarters of his regiment. He was seen in the company of men who were not his social equals, younger officers, aides, even orderlies. The incident, the specific event that detonated the marriage, has been scrubbed from the official archives with surgical precision. The House of Anhalt was thorough. But history is like water. It always finds a crack to leak through. Based on the swiftness of the retribution and the whispers that circulated in the courts of Darmstadt and Berlin for years afterward, we can reconstruct the night the glass house shattered. It likely happened in Dessau, during a brief return to the ducal palace. Dessau was not Berlin, In Berlin, anonymity was possible. In Dessau, the prince lived under a microscope. Every servant was a spy. Every corridor had eyes. The prevailing historical consensus is that Aribert was discovered in a situation of undeniable intimacy with a male companion. Some sources suggest a fellow officer. Others, more damningly, point to a member of the household staff, a valet or a footman. The distinction mattered. An affair with an equal could be framed as intense camaraderie. An affair with a servant was a sordid breach of class boundaries that the German aristocracy found particularly repulsive. Imagine the scene: the heavy silence of the palace at night, the belief that the door was locked, that the world was asleep, the stolen moment of genuine human connection, a touch, a kiss, an embrace that was starving for oxygen. And then the sound that stops the heart, the turning of a handle, the creak of a hinge, the intrusion of light into the dark. It was not a scandal that slowly leaked out. It was a discovery made by someone with the power to act. It might have been the master of the household, or perhaps Duke Friedrich himself, prowling the corridors of his domain. The specifics of who opened the door matter less than what the opening represented. In that second, Aribert ceased to be a prince of the empire, a husband, or a soldier. He became a criminal. Under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, his desires were a felony. But under the unwritten code of the Prussian aristocracy, his crime was worse than a felony. He had made the dynasty vulnerable. He had handed their enemies a weapon. The reaction was instantaneous and nuclear. Duke Friedrich I of Anhalt was 70 years old. He was a man of the old century, a ruler who believed in the divine right of princes and the absolute sanctity of the family name. He ran Anhalt not as a state, but as a personal fiefdom. He was not a man given to negotiation or empathy. When the news was brought to him, or when he saw it with his own eyes, he did not weep for his son's soul. He calculated the damage to his crown. The Duke summoned Aribert to his study. It was likely a terrifying encounter. The Anhalt family dynamic was not one of warmth, it was one of hierarchy. Aribert stood before his father not as a son, but as a subordinate officer facing a court-martial. The Duke laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The scandal could not get out. If the Kaiser heard of this, or worse, if the press got hold of it, the House of Anhalt would be the laughingstock of Europe. The British connection, so carefully cultivated through the marriage to Queen Victoria's granddaughter, was now a liability. If Marie-Louise returned and found out, she might demand a divorce. A contested divorce would mean a public trial. A trial would mean evidence. Evidence would mean ruin. Aribert, pale and likely trembling, had no defense. The evidence was irrefutable. The shame was absolute. He had no leverage. He was financially dependent on his father. His military commission existed at the pleasure of the Kaiser. His entire social existence was a construct of his title. The Duke presented the solution. It was a solution of breathtaking cruelty and efficiency. There would be no divorce. Divorce implied a failed contract between two parties. It implied that a marriage had existed and then broken down. It allowed for the wife to have a say, to ask for a settlement, to give testimony. Instead, the Duke would use his prerogative of the sovereign. As the absolute ruler of Anhalt, he had the power to declare the marriage null and void from its inception. He would frame the annulment around the non-consummation of the union. He would declare that because no heir had been produced and the dynastic obligations were unfulfilled, the marriage was invalid. This legal fiction achieved two things. First, it stripped Marie-Louise of any rights. She was not a divorced wife. She was a woman who had never been married. Second, and most importantly, it silenced the true reason. By focusing on the failure To provide an heir, the Duke placed a veil of dynastic disappointment over the reality of sexual scandal. Aribert was ordered to sign the papers. He was told to resign his commission immediately to avoid a military inquiry. He was told to vanish from public life. The Prince of Anhalt picked up the pen. With a few strokes of ink, he signed away 9 years of his life. He signed away the woman who was currently thousands of miles away, unknowingly representing his family name in the snows of Canada. He signed his own social death warrant. The machinery of the annulment began to turn with terrifying speed. It was a bureaucratic assassination. Letters were dispatched to Queen Victoria and the Kaiser. The wording was carefully crafted by the Duke's chancellery. It spoke of insurmountable incompatibility and dynastic necessity. It hinted with supreme delicacy that the fault lay with the peculiar nature of the prince, without ever using the word homosexual. Queen Victoria dying at Osborne House was too weak to fight it. The Kaiser, terrified of any scandal that might reflect on his own inner circle, agreed to suppress the news. The conspiracy of silence was ratified by the two most powerful thrones in the world. But the most brutal part of the plan concerned Marie-Louise. She could not be allowed to return to Anhalt. If she came back to pack her bags, she might ask questions. She might talk to the servants. She might scream. The Duke wanted a clean break, a surgical amputation. Orders were given to the servants in the couple's apartments in Berlin and Dessau. Princess Marie-Louise's possessions, her clothes, her books, her letters, her jewelry, were to be packed into crates. The photographs of her were taken down from the walls. Her name was scratched from the court circulars. In the span of a week, her existence in Germany was erased. It was as if she had died. The rooms she had lived in for a decade were stripped bare, returned to the sterile state of a guest suite. And then the telegram was sent. Ottawa, December 10th, 1900. The contrast could not have been more cruel. Marie-Louise was having the time of her life. For the first time in years, she felt useful. She was the guest of Lord Minto, the Governor-General. She was reviewing troops, visiting hospitals, and attending sleighing parties on the frozen river. The Canadians adored her. She felt the heavy gray weight of Anhalt lifting off her shoulders. She wrote to her mother saying she felt like a bird let out of a cage. She was sitting in her room at Government House, perhaps dressing for dinner, when the message arrived. "Come home immediately." The brevity of the message induced a cold panic. Her mind raced through the possibilities. The Queen, her mother, Aribert. She went to Lord Minto, her face drained of color. The Governor-General, a kind man, tried to reassure her, but the urgency of the command from London overruled everything. Schedules were cleared, farewells were hastily made. The bird was being yanked back into the cage, the string pulled tight by an unseen hand across the ocean. She left Ottawa in a blizzard, the wind howling around the train carriage. The joy of the trip had turned to ash. She traveled to New York to catch the fastest steamer bound for Liverpool. The voyage across the North Atlantic in December is a punishing experience. The ocean is gray, violent, and freezing. The ship pitched and rolled, mirroring the turmoil in Marie-Louise's stomach. For days, she was trapped in her cabin or pacing the deck, staring at the endless horizon. The isolation was psychological torture. She had no information. The telegraph was a marvel, but it couldn't clarify the mystery in the middle of the ocean. She was suspended in a void of ignorance. She replayed the last 9 years in her mind. Had she failed Aribert? Had she been too English? Had she offended the Duke? She prayed for her husband, imagining him sick, imagining him needing her. She constructed fantasies where she would rush to his bedside, and finally, in his weakness, he would let her love him. She did not know that the man she was praying for had already betrayed her. She did not know that the husband she was rushing to no longer existed legally. She was a woman running toward a house that had already burned down. When the coast of England finally appeared through the mist, her anxiety reached a fever pitch. The ship docked at Liverpool. The gangplank was lowered. She scanned the crowd for Aribert's tall figure, for the glint of his Prussian helmet. He was not there. Instead, she saw her father, Prince Christian, looking old and grim. And beside him stood a man she barely recognized, a stiff, formal court official from Anhalt. Marie-Louise walked down the gangplank. The wind whipped at her coat. She reached her father. He did not smile. He took her hands, his grip tight, almost painful. "Where is Aribert?" she asked. "Is he dead?" Her father shook his head. "No, my dear, he is not dead." He led her to a waiting carriage, the Anhalt official following like a silent executioner. They drove away from the docks, the noise of the port fading. "Louis," her father said, his voice breaking, "you must be brave. The Duke of Anhalt has dissolved your marriage. It is over." She stared at him. The words made no sense. "Dissolved? But I have not been there. I have not signed anything." "It does not matter," her father said gently. "The Duke has exercised his prerogative. The marriage is annulled. You are forbidden to return to Germany. You are forbidden to see Aribert. He has agreed to it." The world stopped. The noise of the carriage wheels, the distant seagulls, the beating of her own heart, everything fell silent. "He agreed?" she whispered. "Yes." At that moment, the true horror hit her. It wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a rejection so total, so absolute, that it defied comprehension. Her husband had not just left her. He had colluded in her erasure while she was halfway across the world. She did not scream. She was a granddaughter of Victoria. She did not make scenes in public. She sat back against the cushions, her spine straightening, her face turning into a mask of ivory. But inside, the romantic, hopeful girl who had walked down the aisle at Windsor 9 years ago quietly died. The carriage rolled on toward London, carrying a woman who was now a widow without a grave to weep over. When Marie-Louise arrived at Osborne House, the Queen's seaside retreat, the atmosphere was already heavy with the scent of lilies and impending death. Queen Victoria, the woman who had defined an entire century, was fading. Her eyesight was failing. Her body was frail. And her mind was weary from the endless casualty lists of the Boer War. Marie-Louise came to Osborne not as a triumphant royal wife, but as a refugee. She was the bearer of a secret that threatened to shatter the peace of the Queen's final days. The meeting between the grandmother and the granddaughter is one of the most poignant, under-recorded moments in royal history. Victoria was the architect of this disaster. She was the one who had scanned the almanacs, approved the bloodlines, and blessed the union with Aribert. She had believed she was securing Louis's future. Instead, she had unwittingly signed her into a decade of psychological confinement. When Marie-Louise entered the Queen's private sitting room, she found a woman diminished. Victoria sat in her wheelchair, draped in her eternal black, her hands trembling. Marie-Louise knelt beside her. There was no need for elaborate explanations. The telegrams from the Duke of Anhalt had already arrived, couched in the diplomatic euphemisms of incompatibility and nervous disposition. But Victoria, even in her twilight, possessed a sharp instinct. She looked at the devastation in her granddaughter's face and understood that this was no ordinary marital spat. "My poor dear Louis," the Queen whispered. It was a pardon. In that moment, the Queen absolved Marie-Louise of the failure. But she also sealed the silence. Victoria was too old, too tired, and too protective of the monarchy's dignity to wage war against a German duchy over an annulment. She accepted the fate accompli. The tragedy was compounded by timing. Just weeks after Marie-Louise's return on January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died. The death of the Queen was a seismic event that shook the world. It marked the end of an era. But for Marie-Louise, it was a perverse stroke of luck. The massive global outpouring of grief for the Queen completely overshadowed the scandal of the Anhalt annulment. The newspapers were filled with black borders and eulogies for Victoria, not gossip about a minor princess's failed marriage. The roar of history drowned out the whisper of her personal tragedy. Marie-Louise walked in the funeral procession, a small black-clad figure lost in the sea of mourners. To the public, she was grieving her grandmother. In reality, she was mourning two deaths: the Queen who had protected her and the woman she herself used to be. While Marie-Louise navigated the funeral rites, a cruel logistical operation was taking place in Germany. True to his word, the Duke of Anhalt was erasing her. He ordered that every trace of the princess be removed from the apartments in Dessau in Berlin. Her clothes, her books, her writing desk, her personal trinkets, everything was packed into wooden crates. When the shipment arrived in England, it was delivered to Cumberland Lodge like a pile of unwanted inventory. Marie-Louise had to unpack her own life. It was a visceral, physical ordeal. Opening the crates, she was hit with the smell of her German home, the scent of the pine woods of Anhalt, the faint odor of Aribert's tobacco smoke that clung to the fabrics, the dust of the palace that had been her prison. There were her ball gowns, the silk stiff and cold. There were the menus she had saved from state dinners. There were the letters she had written but never sent. And there were the wedding gifts, silver sets, porcelain vases that now looked like debris from a shipwreck. But amidst the detritus, there was one object she refused to relinquish: her wedding ring. To the confusion of her family and the consternation of the court, Marie-Louise kept the gold band on her finger. The Duke of Anhalt had declared the marriage void. The law said she was a spinster. The church was silent, but Marie-Louise made a choice that defined the rest of her life. "I made my vows to God," she told a lady in waiting, her voice steel, "not to the Duke of Anhalt." She would not play the part of the divorced woman. She would not be the ex-wife. She cast herself as a spiritual widow. By keeping the ring, she maintained a moral high ground that the Anhalt family could not touch. It was a subtle, silent act of defiance. It said, "I kept my word. You are the ones who broke faith." London in the early Edwardian era was a place of rigid social codes. King Edward VII, Louis's uncle, was now on the throne. The Bertie era was looser, more hedonistic, and more scandalous than Victoria's, but it still had strict rules about women who failed in their matrimonial duties. Marie-Louise entered a strange social purgatory. She was Her Highness Princess Marie-Louise. The of Anhalt was quietly dropped, though not officially stripped until later. She was 29 years old. She was not a debutante, and she was not a matriarch. She was an anomaly. At court balls, there was an awkwardness. Men did not know whether to ask her to dance. Women watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Was she damaged goods? What really happened in Germany? The rumors of Aribert's homosexuality were known to the inner circle, the smart set, but they were never spoken aloud. Instead, people whispered that perhaps Louis had been difficult or barren or too English. She felt the eyes upon her. She felt the sudden silences when she entered a room. For the first year, she retreated. She spent her time at Cumberland Lodge reading religion and history. She suffered from what we would now call severe depression. She had been rejected on a biological and personal level. The man she loved had preferred to risk his entire dynasty rather than touch her. That knowledge is a corrosive acid that eats away at self-worth. She wrote in her diary of gray days and a heaviness of spirit. She was waiting for a permission to live that no one else could give her. Across the channel, Prince Aribert was living his own form of purgatory. He had survived. The annulment had worked. The scandal was contained. He retained his rank, his uniform, and his allowance, but he was a hollow man. The Duke of Anhalt, having ruthlessly cut out the cancer of the marriage, now placed his son under effective house arrest. Aribert was watched. His trips to Capri were curtailed. His correspondence was monitored. He was forced to attend to his military duties with a new, grim determination. In the mess halls of Berlin, the atmosphere had shifted. The officers of the Garde du Corps knew you cannot keep a secret like that in a regiment. The glances exchanged over wine glasses were sharper. The laughter was a little more brittle. Aribert was no longer the golden boy. He was the man who had nearly brought the house down. He retreated into eccentricity. He became obsessed with protocol and history. He channeled his frustrated emotional life into the collection of art and the patronage of museums. He began to build a wall of cold formality around himself that was impenetrable. We have descriptions of him from this period, a tall, solitary figure walking the ramparts of the ducal castles, always alone. He stopped smiling in photographs. The handsome young prince of 1891 hardened into a severe, icy aristocrat. He was safe, but he was dead inside. He had sacrificed his wife to save his skin, and the price was a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Back in England, the turning point for Marie-Louise came not from a person, but from a realization. She realized that the silence was not just a cage, it could also be a shield. If no one was going to talk about her past, she could invent a new future. She decided to stop being a victim. She stopped waiting for invitations and started issuing instructions. She turned her immense unused energy toward the one thing the royal family valued as much as marriage: duty. She threw herself into charity work with a ferocity that startled her family. This wasn't just ribbon cutting, this was hard, grinding work. She became the patron of hospitals, nursing homes, and arts organizations. She didn't just lend her name, she showed up. She sat by bedsides, she audited accounts, she organized fundraising galas, she moved out of her parents' shadow and established her own residence in London. It was a modest household by royal standards, but it was hers. She filled it not with the heavy German furniture of her marriage, but with light, with music, and with friends of her own choosing. She began to cultivate a circle of artists, musicians, and thinkers. She became known as the intellectual princess. She found that in the world of the arts, her status as an annulled woman mattered less than her keen mind and her genuine passion for beauty. She never spoke of Aribert, never, but her actions spoke. Every hospital wing she opened, every concert she patronized, was a brick in the reconstruction of her identity. She was proving to the world and to herself that she was not a discarded vessel. She was a woman of substance. By 1910, a decade after the telegram, Marie-Louise had transformed. She was no longer the frightened girl on the dock at Liverpool. She was a formidable, dignified figure in the Edwardian court. She wore her wedding ring not as a symbol of Aribert, but as a symbol of her own integrity. She had survived the deletion attempt. She was still here. But history had one more cruel twist in store for the former couple. As the years rolled toward 1914, the tension between Britain and Germany grew toxic. The cousins, King George V and Kaiser Wilhelm II, were drifting toward war. Marie-Louise found herself in a terrible position. She was a British princess, but she was technically a German duchess. Her name was German. Her former husband was a German general. When World War I broke out in August 1914, the silence that had protected her suddenly became a liability. The British public, whipped into a frenzy of anti-German sentiment, looked at the royal family with suspicion. They saw the German names, the German husbands. Marie Louise, who had been cast out by Germany, now found herself suspected by Britain. She had to watch as her cousin, the king, changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor to appease the mob. She had to watch as her own family relinquished their German titles. And across the trenches, somewhere behind the lines of barbed wire and poison gas, was Aribert. He was a major general now. The man she had promised to love and obey was now the enemy commander. The war severed the final tenuous threads of communication. There were no more letters, no more news. The Iron Curtain of the Western Front descended. For 4 years, Marie Louise worked in British hospitals, bandaging men who had been shot by her husband's army. It was the ultimate absurdity of their union. The marriage that was meant to bind the two nations together had ended in a silence so profound that it took a world war to physically manifest the distance between them. November 1918, Dessau, Germany. The Great War was ending not with a whimper, but with the crashing sound of crowns hitting the pavement. Across Germany, the revolution was spreading like wildfire. Sailors were mutinying in Kiel. Workers were striking in Berlin. The majestic, terrifying German Empire was dissolving into chaos. In the small capital of Dessau, the storm finally breached the walls of the ducal palace. Prince Aribert was now 52 years old. The war had aged him. He had seen the destruction of the army that was his life's blood. His father, the iron-willed Duke Friedrich I, was dead. His older brothers had died or were incapacitated. By a twist of fate that would have seemed impossible in 1891, the regency of the duchy fell to Aribert. For a brief, flickering moment, he was the ruler. He was the regent for his young nephew, Duke Joachim Ernst. The man who had been cast aside as a liability was now the last line of defense for his dynasty. It was a hopeless stand. On November 12, 1918, a workers' and soldiers' council surrounded the palace. They demanded the abdication of the ducal family. Aribert, standing in the cold, echoing halls where his marriage had disintegrated 18 years earlier, faced the mob. There was no violence, only a gray, bureaucratic finality. Aribert signed the abdication papers. The Duchy of Anhalt, which had existed for centuries, was extinguished. The highness was stripped away. He became, legally, citizen Aribert von Anhalt. The world that had forced him into a sham marriage to protect its own structure had collapsed. The structure was gone. The closet, in a strange way, had been blown open by artillery fire. But for Aribert, liberation came too late. He was a creature of the old world. He did not know how to live in the new Weimar Republic, a place of jazz, democracy, and sexual freedom. He retreated to Munich, the most conservative of German cities. He lived quietly, a ghost of the Ancien Regime. He never married again. He never wrote a memoir. He maintained the silence to the bitter end. London, 1920s and 30s. While Aribert faded into the German twilight, Marie Louise stepped into the light of the modern age. The post-war world was unrecognizable. Women were cutting their hair short, smoking cigarettes, and voting. The rigid Victorian social codes had been blown apart in the trenches of the Somme. Marie Louise adapted. This is the most remarkable part of her third act. She did not become a fossil. She became a bridge. She was now a senior member of the British royal family, a cousin to King George V. She was Princess Marie-Louise once more, the German titles officially stripped by the 1917 Name Change Act. She was free of Anhalt in name, just as she had been in fact. She became the unconventional princess. She was the first royal woman to smoke in public, discreetly after dinner. She drank gin and tonic. She rode buses to see how ordinary people lived. She patronized the ballets russes. But beneath the modern veneer, the old wound remained. She never removed the wedding ring. It was a talisman. It was a signal that while she embraced the modern world, her soul belonged to the past. In 1933, news reached London from Munich. Aribert was dead. He died on June 19, 1933, at the age of 67. The cause was heart failure. He died alone, without a wife, without children, without a country. Marie-Louise received the news with characteristic stoicism. There was no public statement, no memorial service in London. But those close to her noted a quiet devastation. The man who had been the source of her greatest pain was also the only man she had ever loved. His death closed the door on the possibility of reconciliation, a fantasy she had perhaps nurtured in the deepest recesses of her heart, that one day, old and gray, they might meet as friends and explain the unexplainable to each other. That conversation would never happen. Years turned into decades. Another world war came and went. Marie-Louise bomb-dodged in London during the Blitz, refusing to leave the capital, serving tea to soldiers, and visiting bomb sites. She became a national treasure, a little old lady in a hat who represented continuity. In the 1950s, as she entered her 80s, she decided to break the silence. On her own terms, she began to write her autobiography, My Memories of Six Reigns. It was an unprecedented act. Royals did not write tell-alls, but Marie-Louise wanted to leave a record. The book is a masterpiece of evasion. It is charming, funny, and deeply observant. But when she reaches the chapter on her marriage, the prose changes. It becomes stiff, formal, almost brittle. She writes of the incomprehensible nature of her husband. She writes of the annulment with a detached confusion. She never mentions the men. She never mentions the rumors. She protects him. Even from beyond the grave, 50 years after the fact, she refused to out him. She refused to drag his name through the mud. Was it denial, or was it a final profound act of love? By refusing to name the scandal, she preserved the dignity of the young prince she had met in Berlin, the man she had wanted him to be, rather than the man he was. She framed her life not as a tragedy of rejection, but as a triumph of duty. She wrote, I have had a very happy life. It was the lie she had told herself for half a century, polished until it shone like truth. London. Princess Marie-Louise was 84 years old. She was the last survivor of her generation. She had outlived Victoria, Edward VII, George V, and George VI. She had seen the coronation of young Elizabeth II. She was frail, her body failing, but her mind remained sharp. In her final days at her home in Berkeley Square, she was surrounded by the artifacts of her long life. The photos of her grandmother, the sketches she had made in Canada, and on her hand, the thin gold band. She died on December 8, 1956. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same place where, 65 years earlier, she had walked down the aisle in white satin to marry a man who could not love her. She was buried in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, near her parents. She was not sent back to Dessau. She remained in England, the country that had taken her back when the world threw her away. The story of Prince Aribert and Princess Marie-Louise is more than a failed marriage. It is a tragedy of the closet. It illustrates the devastating blast radius of enforced heterosexuality. Aribert was destroyed because he was forced to be something he wasn't. Marie-Louise was destroyed because she was the prop used in his performance. History has often painted Aribert as the villain, the cold, cruel German who discarded the sweet English princess. And history has painted Marie-Louise as the victim, the pathetic, barren spinster. Both views are too simple. Aribert was a victim of a system that demanded he sacrifice his nature for his title. His cruelty was the cruelty of a trapped animal. Marie-Louise was not just a victim, she was a survivor. She took the wreckage of her life and built a cathedral of service upon it. Today, looking back across the chasm of the 20th century, their story stands as a monument to the things that were left unsaid. It reminds us that behind the velvet ropes and the gold medals of royal history, there were real human beings, struggling with desires they could not name and sorrows they could not share. They were two people who entered a contract of silence. Aribert kept his secret to his grave. Marie-Louise kept her vows to hers. In the end, that shared silence was the only thing they ever truly created together.